Hello, this is Kathleen Ralph, creator of the webcomic Hope and Harry. I know how important support is for creators, which is why I support Andy and Derek and the Comics Alternative through Patreon.
This is the Comics Alternative, episode 158, a publisher spotlight on first, second books. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Gwen, and we're two PhDs talking about comics.
That's right. And on this episode of the podcast, we're going to do another publisher spotlight. This one on first, second, and their fall releases. But before we get to those books, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some wonderful specials. Unbelievable, even. Sometimes those specials will be at 45% off cover price, sometimes at 50% off cover price, but often the discounts are quite a bit more impressive than that.
That's right. And Derek, I want to tell you about two wonderful discounts that you can get. One of them is Lumberjanes Volume 2. I mentioned that one. It just is, I think it dropped yesterday. My Facebook feed was filled with excited librarians and children's lit scholars saying that Volume 2 had been released. And at Discount Comic Book Service, they currently have it for $9.74, which is a savings of 35%. But I also wanted to tell folks about a comic that we're going to be talking about later today. It's called Last Man, and it's really quite interesting. I think that folks will maybe want to pick it up after they hear us talk about it. And it's at a 30% savings, coming in at $6.99. So those are both two really great specials that I would recommend.
Oh, great. They always have wonderful discounts at Discount Comic Book Service. You gotta go to the website to see what they are. That's dcbservice.com. Go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Derek and Gwen sent you. Gwen, this is a different show for us because this is the first time you and I have co-hosted together.
That's right. I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, now we were together on a show a couple of weeks ago for International Podcast Day, but there were a lot of us co-hosts together. But this time around, it's just you and me, kid.
That's right, and we go way back, so this should be good.
That's right. You know, and in fact, of all the people who are a part of the Comics Alternative, I have known you the longest.
Yeah, we won't say how long it was, but we were compatriots in graduate school and had a lot of fun there, and I'm so excited to be reconnected and to be doing this now.
Yeah, and, you know, I think this show is right up both of our alleys in that we're focusing specifically on the fall releases from first, second. They do a lot of great books, and it's up my alley because over the past 3 years since we've been doing this podcast, I don't have enough hands to count the number of first, second books we have reviewed on the podcast. But it's also right up your alley because you do a lot of your teaching and research with first, second books.
That's correct. You know, since 2006, when they first started printing, I've been using everything from American-born Chinese to Anya's Ghost and my own research, This One Summer and Relish by Lucy Nisley. Really a lot of the comics also that are coming out of the Franco-Belgian tradition, including ones that we'll be talking about today. So First Second is pretty much one of my go-to presses when it comes to all the work that I do.
Yeah, really good stuff. I'm looking forward to talking about those fall release titles in a few minutes. Before we get to that conversation, though, Gwen, there's something I want to mention to our listeners. If they're not already aware of it, they should check out a relatively new podcast, and this podcast is called Librarians Assemble. And I say it's relatively new. I know that the 8th episode just came out this week, so it hadn't been around that long. But the podcast is all about librarians and comics, or the use of comics and graphic novels in libraries.
Wow.
And one of the hosts is named Josh Stone. And the reason that I'm mentioning this is that our own Andy Wolverton was the guest on the most recent episode, 8, that just recently went up, of Librarians Assemble. So he talks about his work in the Anne Arundel library system, but he also talks about his time on Comics Alternative.
Great. And, Andy and I have had so much fun doing our first 2 shows, so it's exciting to know that other people are learning about it that way.
Yeah, and he mentions the Young Readers Show as well on this episode.
Great. Well, I hope we get lots of librarians listening.
Yes, and if you're not aware of Librarians Assemble, then you can find it by going to their website, and it is librariansassemble.com. That's one word, Librarians Assemble.
I'm glad it's not a verb. What would they be assembling? Okay, ba-dum-bump.
Well, Gwen, you want to talk about the first, second books?
Yeah, absolutely. I found this to be a really enjoyable set of texts to read, really different texts as well, quite a variety. And I know that you said you wanted to start off perhaps with some of the more serious texts that we looked at, or at least ones that are dealing with sort of either nonfiction or else a continued storyline. And that included Battling Boy, which is part of a continuing series, and this is one that I hadn't really been following, so I'm going to lean on you a little bit to hear what you were thinking about the most recent volume in that series. But then the other one that I'll be really excited to talk about is Last Man, because that's a collaboration with, among others, Bastien Vives, who's a French comics creator whom I've been studying and writing about for about the last 5 years. So I'm really excited that First Second has his text now in translation. And then I was really moved by Omaha Beach, which is a nonfiction comic and deals with basically a graphic novel exploration of sort of the story behind one of the famous photographs to come out of D-Day. And so maybe we want to start with those 3 and then move on to some of the texts that are a little bit more lighthearted in terms of, and for slightly younger readers, I think.
Exactly. Well, before we get into a discussion of the show, let's just briefly mention what we're doing. And I know this is the first time that you've been on one of these episodes, and
Right.
This may be the first time that our listeners have heard one of our publisher spotlights. But occasionally, what we like to do on the Comics Alternative is to choose a publisher, just one publisher, and focus on their seasonal output. Now, how you define that seasonal output depends on the publisher. So some of the, fairly good size active publishers like First Second, when we say seasonal, we mean seasonal. Right now we're dealing with, I think it's 7 books that we're going to be discussing on the show.
Right.
So, that's what First Second is going to be putting out, or has been, and then I think as of this week have put out.
Right.
The most recent release is Omaha Beach on D-Day. And in addition to the ones that you've already mentioned, we're also going to be discussing Jean-Louis Yang and Mike Holmes' Secret Coders, Maris Wicks' Human Body Theater, Ian Lendler and Zack Giallongo's The Stratford Zoo Midnight Review presents Romeo and Juliet, and Chris Duffy's edited collection Fable Comics. Mm-hmm. So we got a lot to discuss. But getting back to the publisher spotlight, we're looking at the fall releases for a second. Sometimes when we do this, though, we're looking at a very small press, and so seasonal release could be like comics that have come out in the 6 or 9 months, maybe even a year that they've put out. But we like to do these occasionally because it allows us to do a deep dive into publishers that we think are really good and do the kind of comics that we discuss on the Comics Alternative.
Yeah, and this is just a really beautiful collection of comics, all really well drawn and filled out in terms of story. I so enjoyed reading them, and just really excited to talk about them.
Okay. Well, you mentioned that we're going to start with Battling Boy, The Fall of the House of West. This is written by Paul Pope and J.T. Petty with art by David Rubin. And you said that you don't have as much experience with Battling Boy. So have you read any of the Battling Boy books?
No, I have not. I feel remiss. And I'm going to now because I started, obviously, to read this one. And that's why I had a little bit of trouble because I was missing context. With Last Man, I'd read the first 2, so it was easy to get into the third. So that's why I'm sort of leaning on you, my friend, to tell me what I need to know. But the drawing style is amazing. In fact, it really reminds me of some other comics creators. So I'm interested to see what you say, and it'll be fun to talk about that.
Okay. Well, the first book in the Battling Boy series, Battling Boy, came out a couple of years ago, 2013, at about this time in the season. This one was by Paul Pope. In fact, he was the sole creator in that book, did the writing as well as the art. And that book, I'm holding it in my hand right now, and I'm holding it also right next to the most recent Battling Boy, The Fall of the House of West. The difference in size and packaging really is significant in that Battling Boy, that came out a couple of years ago, it's a larger format book, and it's got very vibrant colors, and so you have colored, really high glossy pages, and it's quite a bit more substantial in terms of its feel in your hand. And The Fall of the House of West, which just recently came out, is very similar in size and texture, figuratively and literally, to the book that came out last year, Battling Boy, The Rise of Aurora West. And these are kind of a thinner paper, more like your, let's say, traditional comics, if we want to describe it that way. The art is black and white, and it's a smaller book. So this is something about the size, The Fall of the House of West, about the size of, let's say, volumes of manga.
Right.
And it feels that way as well. So in terms of the books, the way that they look and the way that they feel, those are some of the differences. But the first in the series, Battling Boy, written by Paul Pope, and when this came out, they announced that there was going to be a series of Battling Boy books, that the one after Battling Boy was going to be The Rise of Aurora West, that Pope was going to help write, but then others, in this case J.T. Petty and David Rubin, were going to be involved with. And I had assumed, and I think Andy Kunka and I even discussed this in a previous episode, that we just kind of thought that every issue or volume of Battling Boy, they would kind of stagger it. So, for instance, in 2013, it was Paul Pope's Battling Boy. And then last year, it was the book on Aurora West. That this year, it would be another Paul Pope Battling Boy volume. And then next year, The Fall of the House of West. But that's not the way it worked out. So I don't know where we got that kind of staggered scheduling. But regardless, it's interesting to see how this story is unfolding. Now, if you haven't read the earlier Battling Boy books, which, Gwen, you say you haven't.
Right.
What Battling Boy, the very first one, does is to focus on the titular character, a young kid named Battling Boy, and his background is very similar to, let's say, Thor. Okay. He does come from what looks like a Nordic background, and it does play around with both mythology and the superhero genre. Pope does, and you have a young kid who is coming of age, and his father is almost like an Odin type figure. And he is wanting to become a hero, and it's been a while since I read this. I didn't go back and reread this one like I did last year's Rise of Aurora West to prepare for today's show. If for no other reason, I couldn't find my copy of Battling Boy in time. I do have it now, but he wants to go down to Earth in order to get his hero chops, so to speak. And so he becomes involved in the town. Oh, what is the city called? In House of West. I'm blanking here on the name of the city where they live. Can you remember?
Okay, no, because I'm terrible with names.
Oh.
I have like 8 comics going through my head right now.
Okay, and I'll think of it, I'm sure, as we go on discussing this. But Battling Boy goes down to the city, and in Battling Boy, Haggard West. This is toward the beginning of the book, and so it's no spoiler. Also, this has been out for a couple of years. Haggard West dies.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so that's where Haggard comes in, and then it's primarily the story of Battling Boy and his exploits here on Earth. And then last year's The Rise of Aurora West, the book is all about Aurora West. We see her as a young girl who grows up in the household of her father, who is a hero, and mother. And we learn that the mother dies through some mysterious means, but it has something to do with a character who is part of this evil monster gang, someone by the name of Coil. And we learned this toward the last half of last year's Battling Boy, The Rise of Aurora West. And Aurora comes to learn that, what she thought was an imaginary friend when she was a little girl was actually not imaginary at all, but some kind of a strange, almost ethereal monster that was in the process of forming, a creature that she and her parents picked up when they were doing some research in Egypt. And so this quote-unquote imaginary friend comes back with them, starts to take form, and eventually becomes a character, a monster by the name of Coil, who then joins a group of villainous monsters led by Sadisto, which and we do
I love that.
Yeah, and we do see Sadisto in the very first Battling Boy book, and he was a big part of last year's Rise of Aurora West. And the Rise of Aurora West ends with her realizing this connection between her imaginary friend and Coil, and that's where we pick up with the recent release, The Fall of the House of West.
Right. Well, one of the things that I just am picking up on when you were talking about the original volume, I actually just looked at some of the images from it. And the thing that struck me about this most recent volume is that because it's in primarily gray tones, I'm seeing a real similarity in some of the drawings with Charles Burns's Black Hole, which is fascinating. I'm on page 16 and 17 of the comic right now, and not just in terms of the way that lines are drawn, but even perspective. Burns sort of specializes in looking at characters from above, and you're looking down at the characters. And so this is a part of the text where the character's remembering when she was a child stealing cake out of the fridge. And I swear it could come right out of Black Hole. I mean, there's some homage going on there, I think. So just from a stylistic viewpoint, I was drawn into the comic based on that. Burns is dealing with a lot of issues involving characters trying to figure out themselves, their bodies, what they're doing, and so I thought that was a sort of nice connection, actually. I don't know if you saw that.
No, I didn't. Oh, and by the way, I remember the name of the town, Acropolis.
Oh, well, okay.
Yeah, but no, it's interesting that you mentioned Charles Burns, especially in terms of the perspective, because when you mentioned that, I thought art style, that didn't jibe with me, and I'll tell you why, because I was already thinking of Paul Pope. One of the things that strikes me about Rubin's art is that he is a great, I don't know if you want to call it a substitute for, but a companion to Paul Pope and his art in the very first Battling Boy book. And I don't know if that's why they chose him as the artist of these Aurora West volumes, but it just makes sense to me because his style is if not very similar to, then to use the Melvillian double negative, not dissimilar to the art that you would find with Paul Pope in Battling Boy and others as well. So going from one book to the other, from 2013's Battling Boy to these Aurora West books, it's relatively seamless in terms of the visuals.
Oh, okay. Well, then I need to look at the first books because I really love the style, and it definitely draws me in.
And, another thing, though, about your Charles Burns reference, now that I think of it, it does make sense in that, as we know, and many of our listeners probably know with Charles Burns, the tone of his narratives are rather disturbing. Mm-hmm. And you get these even with narratives of his that seem like, at least on the surface, they are intended for a younger audience, even though they're definitely not. And I'm thinking of the Big Baby stories. I think a lot of people may know Charles Burns for Black Hole, and I think that's what he's most famously known for. But his very early stuff, Mr. Blister and then Big Baby, Big Baby is this, as it sounds, kind of a kid who is big, and he gets into these strange adventures, but they're surreal, kind of disturbing, rather Freudian, and that's the kind of art that you see. And I think that the dark underworld of existence, the dark side of existence, I guess, is what we see going on in the various Battling Boy books. Mm-hmm. Because on the surface, you have characters like Battling Boy, or in the most recent book, Haggard and his daughter Aurora, and they're trying to fight the monsters, save the day, make everything safe and happy for kids especially. Mm-hmm. But in the city of Acropolis, in this world of Aurora and Haggard West and Battling Boy, there is a dark underworld that is out to annihilate people, especially kids. And they don't sugarcoat it. They take kids, they use them, they kill them. And so I think that darkness that you had, referenced in terms of Charles Burns is definitely here with Aurora, The Fall of the House of West in this volume. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's just some amazing images, too, in this text. A lot of floating panels. Really, there's some, I don't know. I'm looking over at page 60, and there's this big, huge sort of fight going on, and the way that it's portrayed, the sort of character's agony and little snapshots that are floating, it's really fascinating. So it's beautiful to look at, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So in addition to what's going on, I'm really enjoying looking at the comic.
I agree, and I think that gets back to David Rubin's art, or at least the choice of him as the artist in these Battling Boy books. One of the things I love about Paul Pope's work, and not just Battling Boy, but his other comics as well, they're very kinetic, and Pope does a great job when it comes to action scenes. Again, Rubin does a wonderful job of representing that movement, that action, that violence in the way that he not only draws within panels, but the way that he lays out the panels. An example of which would be page 60, which you just referenced. Mm-hmm. So through the layout, through the mise-en-page, he definitely captures the action. And this gets back to something that I said earlier, that these Battling Boy books, one way to read them are as superhero narratives, but they're stories that are self-conscious and are playing upon our expectations of the superhero genre without participating in a lot of the, what shall I call them, shenanigans that have come to define superhero comics. Mm-hmm. For instance, the coming back to life, the endless switching of identities. And I think one of the things that Paul Pope in the Aurora West books, J.T. Petty and David Rubin do, is they breathe new life into the genre, and for younger readers.
Yeah, absolutely. Really just, I find the storyline so fascinating. There's lots of creatures that emerge in this setting, and and they're all uniquely grotesque, and their ends are uniquely grotesque as well. So when I think about young readers, Andy and I were talking about this last week with, the more gross it is, the squishier it is, the more dramatic it is, the better. And there's a lot of that going on in this comic as well.
A lot of squishiness.
A lot of squishing.
Yeah. And this gets to a question I wanted to ask you, because you deal with a lot of comics for younger readers. And, of course, you and Wolverton do the monthly series now for young readers. After reading Battling Boy, The Fall of the House of West, do you consider this a book targeting younger readers, teenagers?
I'd say teens. And I say that both because of the subject matter, but also because of the complexity of drawings. Andy and I were talking about this last week. Actually, we did a spot on Vita Assembly Required by Samuel Tier and Hundo Park, and we were talking about chaperoning with comics reading and the comics that kids start to read on their own and enjoy and are able to follow what's going on panel to panel, page to page, and those comics that really imply a much younger reader. I would say clearly probably a middle grade or teen reader would enjoy these comics and could figure out what's going on, because you're right, just from the perspective of page layout, there's a great deal of complexity. And yet, I would argue, one of the things that I find kind of interesting, like I'm looking over I've gone a little deeper into the comic on page 110, 111 on that spread, where you have everything from floating panels to text bubbles that are giving you a direction of where you're supposed to read. I guess what I'm trying to say is when I think about intended audience for a comic, I don't just think about the content. I think about the clues that are left behind by the comics creator to draw the eye, to help the reader through, so that the reader doesn't lose interest and so that the continuity isn't broken up. And I think it's done very well here. I think that just in terms of comics layout. And again, these aren't things that many comics readers who are younger may think through. Like, oh, I'm enjoying this read because it's easy to follow from panel to panel, even when it's complex. But to me, that's one of the key markers that I look for.
And one of the reasons why I asked you your thoughts on The Fall of the House of West, in terms of audience, I remember when Battling Boy first came out, I think originally when I read it, I didn't think of it as a book for younger readers. And then when I started to talk about it with others, and especially once it was nominated for an Eisner, and people were talking about it as a young reader text, I thought, I guess so, but and maybe because it was Paul Pope who was the creator on the book, I didn't think that it was a young reader, but I should have in light of the fact that it's a first-second book. And maybe we can pause and take a moment to discuss the kind of audience that First Second seems to target with most of their books. Not all of their books by far, but I think with most of them. They're either, and I think the books that we're discussing on today's episode will bear this out, primarily younger readers. Every now and again, though, there'll be one, like, for instance, Omaha Beach for a more mature readership. But if it is for more mature readers, I would say it's like an all-age book more than it is for younger readers. Yeah, it's still
accessible. I would say Omaha Beach is still accessible for younger readers. Especially, I think, because there's so much narrative in that comic that gives you the exposition and the background that it's pretty easy to follow along. But, I'm thinking about Battling Boy. Part of it is just the subjectivity of a young woman coming of age while also facing all of these challenges. Or in Last Man, where you have a young boy who is looking up to an older man in terms of trying to figure out what kind of fighter he wants to be. I think First Second, often, even if the themes might be sort of enjoyable for all readers, there's almost always a character there who's a young person coming of age. Just think about The Professor's Daughter, or even Relish by Lucy Nisley, which is in some ways a nonfiction comic focusing on her growing up in a family of culinary experts. But that's the whole point. It's about her growing into enjoying different types of food, different cuisines, preparing them, working with them, all the way way up through when she's in grad school, working in a cheese shop and having to deal with cheese snobs. There's ways in which all of these books, in some aspect or another, deal with typically young characters. Not always, as you said, but I mean, even if you look at the D-Day book, we're dealing with a lot of young men who are, 18, 19 years old, facing an incredible challenge.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, I'm having a hard time thinking of a first, second book that I'm not certain I would give to a younger reader, and there are a couple that possibly come to mind. One is Mark Siegel's Sailor Twain, which came out also in 2013. And in fact, Mark Siegel, isn't he the publisher of First Second?
Yeah, he runs First Second as the editor.
Yes. I think Sailor Twain is a rather mature book. And also some of their other titles, and Feynman comes to mind, that is more biography, history, philosophy, science-based. Not that because it's science-based, it wouldn't be for younger readers, but I think that one, I don't know. That would be more of a toss-up. But I definitely think that Sailor Twain is for a more mature reader.
Yeah, whenever I've seen that book talked about, it almost always includes the tag, his novel for adults. And I think that, in fact, maybe because he comes out of First Second, reviewers and readers want to underscore that, because I think a lot of people associate First Second with at least all-age readership.
Yeah.
And so that may be one of the reasons that everybody tags that as an adult comic.
Mm-hmm. Well, coming back to the Battling Boy series, as I said, I was a little surprised to some degree that Battling Boy was being read as a narrative for younger readers. But I think you can definitely see this in the Aurora West books. So last year's The Rise of Aurora West and this year's The Fall of the House of West, these definitely do strike me as appropriate for young readers, in terms of not only the art, as you've mentioned, but, the subject matter and the theme. And as you pointed out, with Aurora, we have a young female character coming of age, learning how to be a hero, making mistakes along the way. And we do see her at a much younger age at various places in her two books. Mm-hmm. So, this is something that if let's say, the superhero comics are notorious for kind of excluding young female readers. And I think over the past several years, there have been certain attempts to kind of remedy that situation. But if you wanted to introduce a younger female reader to superhero books, then instead of giving them Batgirl, which you could, why not give them the Aurora West books?
Yeah, and I love, the way it ends in a way with whatever it is, we'll be ready for it. There's that kind of can-do sort of thing around her. But actually the backstory to this comic is really fascinating, and it's set in a sort of interesting urban setting. There's just ways in which it doesn't feel formulaic. I really think that a young reader would enjoy this text because it's very creatively done. And as you said, there's a lot of opponents in this comic that are fascinating to look at. Their demise is interesting. So, I don't know. I certainly know if I were a teen, I would love this book.
Exactly. So. And you mentioned how the Fall of the House of West ends, and we're not giving away spoilers here. But
sorry.
No, that's okay. No. Part of it includes another character we haven't mentioned yet, and she's a minor character but significant nonetheless. And this is Miss Greatly. Mm-hmm. I don't think we know her first name, or if we do, I've forgotten it. But Aurora keeps calling her Ms. Greatly, and she is a fighter who has been working alongside her father Haggard from, I don't know if it's from the beginning because we don't have a complete backstory on Ms. Greatly yet, but she is big, she's tough, she's muscular, and we know she's been through the ringer and has paid the dues because one of her legs is missing, so she's on a prosthetic. Right. And this is one of the many reasons why Aurora looks up to her. So she becomes a mentor to Aurora in ways that her father can't, because there is that kind of father-daughter, parent-child antagonism that goes on every now and again.
And she knows some of the backstory to that and unfolds it. I don't want to say any more, but she's a very interesting character, and I like that the interplay between them in this comic. So, And she is muscular. Dang. I've got maybe 50 years on like a Bowflex to look like this person. So,
So yeah, I'm glad that we have another Battling Boy book out this year. So I'm hoping that next year will be 4 in a row, and maybe the next Paul Pope Battling Boy.
yeah. Well, I'm glad that I've been introduced to this, and now I'm going to go back and read the first 2. I feel like I need to get the backstory to fully appreciate the comics, so I'm looking forward to that.
Yes, your homework for next time.
That's right.
Well, let's talk about another series that we've referenced already, and that is Last Man. And the most recent in this series, it's the 3rd volume, is Last Man, The Chase. Now, this is by Balak, Michel Sanlaville, and Bastien Vives. Am I butchering those names too much?
Well, the only one Vives for Bastien. Bastien Vives.
How did I pronounce it?
I can't remember, but it wasn't exactly like that, but
okay.
That's okay.
Okay, we'll go back to the tape on that one. But now this is one that you were familiar with, and you said you've even worked on Vives before, correct?
I have. You know, when I first started studying comics theory, I had the opportunity to travel to Brussels and to Paris to pick up books. And one of the first books that I saw in a comic store in Brussels was a book called Paulina, which had just been released. It was a single author text by Bastien Vives, and it was beautiful. It ended up, I believe, winning the Angoulême Award that year for Best Comic. And the minute that I saw this and started looking through it, the clerk came up and said, "Oh, but you must see all of his works." And so I ended up buying all of them and bringing them home with me. He's one of those, they call him a wunderkind whenever he's mentioned in the press, because he was pulled out of art school by Casterman, the big publisher of Franco-Belgian comics. And his first comic was published when he was only, I believe, 23 years old. And for our listeners who are unfamiliar with Franco-Belgian comics, the production values for mainstream comics like the ones put out by Casterman are extremely high. These are beautiful, large texts with gorgeous color and page, the quality of the paper is excellent. And to have a 23-year-old who was still in art school land a volume with a major publisher was a big deal. And he has almost rock star status in France. So if you were to Google him, invariably you'll find some fangirl pages and that sort of thing. He's also a hoot to follow on Twitter. He's always tweeting about his escapades. He's quite the sort of toast of the town in Paris. But my work with him involved looking at the way that he depicts female subjectivity, because as a comics creator, he's very interested in portraying women. And one of the things that I've shown in my own scholarship is that over the course of his career, he's worked more and more of creating comics from the perspective of a woman's point of view. And I'll just say really briefly, if you're interested in his work, his single author work, a couple texts I would recommend. One would be In My Eyes, which is a comic that's told entirely, it's about a relationship, and it's told entirely from the perspective of an unnamed young man. And all you see in the comic is his interactions with this woman from his perspective. It's done in pastels. There are no borders to the panels, so that each page has about 8 pastel panels, but they're unbordered. And it almost looks like you're looking through someone's eyes at this particular character. So the entire romance between these two characters is set forward in that way, which is really creative. But it's his work in Paulina where he shows something that I think is important to tie into Last Man, and that is his fascination with the human body, the way it moves in time and space, and especially the way that people who have a great deal of control over their body will then use their body. So, for instance, he had a text called "The Taste of Chlorine" about a young man who's doing rehab in a swimming pool, and a lot of the text focuses on his body in the pool. In Polina is a ballerina who's training in Russia to be sort of an extremely accomplished dancer, and so a lot of the text focuses on her body and the way it moves in space. And I think that's really relevant if we want to sort of scoot into talking about Last Man to the sort of art that is present in that particular comic, because there's a lot of combat. And I can always tell the pages that Vives has drawn, because he will focus in on different body parts and then show how the entire body is moving as well through space. So it's really well done.
Yeah, because I just know of Vives' work in the Last Man series. Now, he's the artist here. This is written by Balak and Sanlaville. And we should point out that this is the third so far of the series. Earlier this year, First Second published the first volume in translation, The Stranger, and then I think over the summer the second volume came out, The Royal Cup. Now, this one is titled The Chase. Right. And you've read both The Stranger and The Royal Cup, correct?
Right.
Yeah. Now, The Stranger introduces us, as you would expect, being the first book, to the situation. So we have a young boy by the name of Adrian Velba, and then his mother, Marianne. But it's primarily about Adrian, and he is fascinated by this kind of competition fighting that we have in the series. And it's an interesting kind of battle. It reminds me of some of the stuff that you would find in several manga series, but there's magic involved, which, you'll also find in certain manga series. But it's, very ritualized. And so he's fascinated by this, even though he is a small kid and not very effective in the arena. He ends up meeting a character, an adult by the name of Richard Aldana, who wanders into town, thus the title of that first volume, The Stranger. So he seems to come out of nowhere, and he finds out about this competition, and he wants to be a part of the competition because he wants to win the prize money, the rewards that go along with it, and he ends up befriending Adrian primarily because of Adrian's mother, who... You were talking about the way that Vives represents a female form. She's a very striking woman.
Yes, she is. And this is very typical of Vives. In his first comic that he drew, it was an entire comic from the perspective of this young man who was infatuated with a woman and couldn't speak to her, that typical thing. Richard Aldana does not have that problem.
No.
At all. And so part of it, obviously, one of the major plot points that works through the series will be the relationship between Richard and Adrian's mother. And Marianne, right? I'm
Correct.
having one of those. Yes. Okay. Awesome. Watch Derek and Gwen remember proper nouns from the comics they're reading. But she's obviously he's a man about town, even though he's only been in town about 5 minutes.
Right. And, he's an unconventional fighter. He comes from a different place, which we learn about in this most recent volume that we're discussing, The Chase. Right. But interestingly enough, we don't see much of any of Richard in The Chase. He has a big role in the first two books. Now, the second volume that came out this summer, The Royal Cup, is actually, I guess it's primarily the big competition. This is when they win and win big, Richard and Adrian. And the prize that they win is called The Royal Cup, thus the subtitle of that second volume. Right. It's also in that second volume that not only that we have the big climactic battle, but also the beginnings of a relationship, finally a romantic relationship between Richard and Marianne. Now, one of the things I find striking about this new volume, The Chase, is I think, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. This is Marianne's book.
Oh, absolutely.
Definitely. And, Richard is almost nowhere to be seen. If he appears, it's usually through name reference, and that's it. I mean, her son Adrian's a big part of this as well, but I think by far the major character in the chase is his mother, Mary Ann. And she had been a significant, although at times a background character in the first 2 volumes. But she becomes a major player here in the chase, but also we start learning a lot more about her. Now, there's a lot of mystery still about her past and how she knows to do some of the things that we see going on in the chase. And those are going to be answered in the story to come, I guess. But, the thing that Balak, Sanlaville, and Vives have done is really set her up and set her stage in this most recent volume.
I'm excited by that because initially in the first volume and even in the second volume, her claim to fame, in addition to her beauty, was her amazing ability to cook.
Yes.
And I was fine with that. I'm a good cook, for instance, right? And I'm known for my stunning beauty. But the point is there's more to me than that. And it turns out that there's more to her than that as well. In fact, there's almost, I would say that by the third volume, we've entered into a dystopian setting, and she goes flying through it, quite literally on a motorbike, in a way that it definitely shows that she is in control and command. And as you said, she has some knowledge that I'll be interested to see sort of the origins of that knowledge. But she's extremely handy, as it turns out.
Exactly. Now, you mentioned that she literally goes flying into this different land, this realm, this dystopia. We should mention that at the very end of the second volume, The Royal Cup, she and Richard have just, how shall we put it, consummated their budding relationship, but then Richard leaves. And so this surprises her, and if it angers her, we really don't see that much, but she becomes very determined. She tells her son Adrian that they're going to go away and they're going to look for Richard, and so she takes Adrian to a motorcycle that she has hidden away, and Adrian is like, where did this come from? Why have you never shown it to me before? How do you know how to ride it? And so it's at this point, at the tail end of Volume 2, that Mary Ann starts to display bits of knowledge and some abilities that we weren't aware of before, we never suspected. And so this is where the chase, the most recent volume, begins. She and Adrian are getting ready to leave the Valley of the Kings, or the Valley of Kings, which is their land, which is kind of a fantastical world. Okay, so some of that aforementioned magic in terms of the fighting is where you'll find in the Valley of Kings. And so she and Adrian are on a motorcycle, and they get to this part of the realm that is very clouded, foggy. You can, not see things very well, and it almost looks like they're about to drive off the cliff. But basically, she takes the motorcycle and goes into a completely different world, which is a place that more closely resembles the world that we live in, even though it's very different. As you mentioned, it's rather dystopic. It reminds me of something that you'll find in Mad Max movies.
That's exactly what I was thinking. It's like going from the Middle Ages into Mad Max.
Right.
Is really what it feels like in terms of, and what I wish that I knew more about the Land of the Kings. I think that I'm really looking forward to book 4. I know we're talking about book 3, but this is one of those comics where it's very tantalizing. There's little hints dropped here and there about characters, their motivation, their knowledge, etc. And I keep waiting for it to all come together. But I really like in some ways I enjoy the mystery when she walks off into that foggy space in order to scout it out before she and her son pass over into it. I was really intrigued, wondering what was going to happen. When she comes back, though, she seems to really know what she's doing and is confident that they will make it okay. But it also, once she moves over to the other side, all of the things that I think, all the things that she encounters almost immediately are like the very worst of that world. And I think that part of what is implicit in this is just the way that her beauty makes her a target. And And so we go from this sort of ethereal land into this very dystopic land, and her body now is something that all of the men whom she encounters, they want it for some reason, either for personal pleasure or gain, and she has to deal with that, all the while having as a sidekick her 7 or 8 year old son.
Exactly. And
so it's an interesting buddy movie in that respect.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of it as a buddy movie,
comic.
But that makes sense to me.
But really, I mean, that's the weird thing. I mean, in the first 2 books, Adrian is a buddy to a man who's clearly in his late 20s or 30s. And now he's off on this adventure with his mom. And so, usually you'll have a comic where it's 2 kids against the world, or, it's 2 adults. This is really a different kind of comic. And when we talk about young readers, I was immediately thinking about the ways in which Adrian ends up earning the respect of both Richard Aldana and his mother. And it still is sort of playing into that buddy film conceit or the buddy comic conceit where the younger or perhaps less able person ends up showing the veteran, right, that he or she knows something. But in this instance, it's a true child. So it's really interesting.
Yeah. Now, you were mentioning again the younger reader aspect of these books that we're discussing for this episode, the first, second fall releases. With the Last Man series, it's a little more complicated than, let's say, Battling Boy, or let's say another book that we're going to be discussing, which is the first of a new series, Secret Coders, that there are some very mature elements to the Last Man series. You mentioned the dystopic world that Adrian and his mother Marianne go into. From the very beginning, when they're in that world, they encounter that land's police force, and of course these are corrupt cops. They're very lustful. They're greedy, and so from the very beginning of her time there is the threat of rape, and I don't think that threat in abuse, and I don't think that threat abates at any point. She shows herself to be adept at fighting off those threats, but the threat is always there. So that's where part of the maturity comes into play here. So if this is a book for younger readers, it's one that definitely has a more European flavor to it. And she and Adrian take refuge in, of all places, a brothel.
Right. That's where the fact that this has been translated from the French. This was a big hit in France before it now is coming to us in translation. I think that's showing one of those cultural differences. For instance, in the second volume, Adrian actually sees his mother having sex with Richard. Right. And in that same volume, we see Richard's naked body a number of times. In fact, he's almost put forward as an Adonis at one point. We never see any full frontal nudity, but actually he in this text is the one who is unclothed as opposed to Marianne. So you have that sort of turning about. But yeah, I'd actually like to look it up. So while we're talking here, because usually when a book shows up on Amazon and it's a comic, sometimes they'll give an age designation. But I will say that if this had been a comic created originally for the U.S. market, I think that some of the language and some of the actions probably would have either been censored or edited out, or maybe a comics creator wouldn't even think of them if he or she were trying for a teen audience. But I could be wrong.
Yeah, this is something that I would give to younger readers to a point, but not too young.
Right. And also it's just, I think it would be confusing. The third book, especially The Chase, once you enter into that dystopian world, it takes a while to get your bearings. And I think that's intentional. In other words, the reader is supposed to feel just as unsure as the characters. Exactly. Or at least as Adrian, because I think that a lot of, it's easy to forget, but a lot of this is focalized through Adrian, trying to figure out the world. Not all of it, but some of it.
Yeah,
and
in fact, many of the visual angles in this book, and I think in the series as a whole, is of Adrian looking wide-eyed, and sometimes it's almost as if we're looking down on him as he's looking up and trying to make sense of things.
Well, Derek, I'm just looking at it now, and The Stranger is listed from School Library Journal as grade 8 and up. And the Royal Cup, which has all that nudity, let's see, grade 8 and up is the way that these are being described. So just FYI on at least the way that the editors have put forward the text. Right now, the chase isn't listed because probably, it needs to be released a bit longer to be reviewed. But there we go. So, yeah.
But you're right about in the chase, how the story unfolds, it becomes quite confusing and unsettling. Especially occurs when Adrian and Marianne are picked up by, and this is going to sound strange, but the attorney fighters.
Right.
Because in this society, there are a couple of people who come, or actually there are three that come once they discover Marianne and Adrian, they take them away. And one is a judge, and he is dressed like a judge, and so he does look like a judge. And then the two people who are with him are described as attorneys, but these are big hulking characters, and they look a little off. I mean, I think they're wearing their attorney garb, but still they don't look like attorneys, at least the ones that we may recognize from, Law and Order and other such television shows. But and we find out that part of the trial involves fighting.
Yeah. So
just as in the earlier Last Men books, when we were in the Valley of Kings, and there was, much of the culture was based on the Festival of the Fights. Here we have the system of law in this other world is also based on fighting.
Right. And yeah, I'm looking at some of the pictures of the attorneys, and it's like almost a sort of academic mixed with a colonel from a very opulent military outfit type thing, and they just look really. It's fascinating. This is a world that reminds me a lot. I mean, I think it's making commentary on contemporary society, given the setting. It feels like the Wild West, if you will, to a certain extent. Everything has just gone wild, and I don't know, it's really fun to read. And so it's such a disjunction with the first two texts, which they felt much more pastoral. Not that the society described therein is perfect either. There's a lot of things going on behind the scenes with people in power that is distasteful. But here, it's just everywhere, and Marianne's vulnerability is underscored in this text in ways that I don't think we saw dealt with in the first two.
Right.
So.
And something else about this third volume that we see at the tail end of the book is a character who played an important role in the second book, The Royal Cup, but we see him just him or she or it, who knows, because we really don't know much about this character, Christo.
Right.
And he was one of the major fighters in the second volume, and I had just assumed that, Christo, his character was done, that we wouldn't see him again.
Right.
But then when I saw him at the very end of the chase, I thought, there is something about him that was unanswered in that second volume. So this makes sense now that he's being brought back for some purpose. And so, like you, I'm anticipating the next volume, number 4.
Also, I just want to say that one of the attorneys is called Attorney Raven. Does he look like Steven Tyler to you at all? Because I'm telling you, he's got the bandana on backwards, and he's got the big lips, and I swear I'm just waiting for Aerosmith's song to start playing in the middle of the comic.
Okay. See, I was about to say I really, absolutely, unquestionably love the Last Man series, but then you brought in a reference to Aerosmith, and I want you to know you have ruined this series for me from here on in.
My work here is done.
Oh, God. Okay, I'm depressed now.
But it's true, isn't it?
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, I am right.
Damn you, Gwen.
Ruining series since 2015. Comics alternative. Oh, well. Well, do we want to say anything else about this wonderful comic before we move on?
Well,
now that I've ruined it for you?
Yeah, well, we do need to move on now, but I can't recall how many volumes in this series are planned.
Well, there were 10, I believe there were 10 volumes originally, but I don't know how those are being parsed out in the translations. But I know that at the end of Volume 3, it says, look forward to Volume 4 coming soon. So, and I don't have the originals, so I don't know. But I think it's possible it could extend out then to another 6 volumes. So, and that would be helpful because I have about 6,000 questions that have been unanswered from this that are intriguing me. So I'm actually looking forward to the next volume. I'm excited.
Well, let's move on to the third book they're going to be looking at. And in fact, this one came out this week as we're recording the episode, and that is Omaha Beach on D-Day. This is written by Jean-David Morvan and I believe Dominique Bertail, and it's based on... illustrated by Bertail, and it's based on the life of the famous photographer, the war photographer, Robert Capa.
Yeah, it's a beautiful, primarily black and white comic in the style of, I think, other pretty prominent and interesting comics that are set during times of conflict. I immediately thought of Jacques Tardi's It Was the War of the Trenches, Joe Sacco's War Reportage, and it's a beautiful, evocative volume. One of the things that we haven't talked about too much today yet is language, and there's a line that I pulled out of Omaha Beach in which a commander is talking about his troops who are in the boats that are about to leave for the D-Day invasion, and he says, my troops fall into 3 categories. He says, the planners, the gamblers, and the writers of goodbye letters. Mm-hmm. And that just kind of gripped me a little bit because, you know, this is a very poignant text in many ways, looking at 18, 19, 20-year-old kids, essentially, who are about to engage in one of the sort of most brutal battles in war history. And that description, even though the pictures are wonderful, and there's a lot I'm sure we'll say about that, I thought that the writing was beautiful too.
Exactly. Now, you mentioned the kind of book this is. This is a kind of a long book, horizontal format, and comics are only half, maybe not even quite half of this book, or maybe half now that I'm looking at it. But the first half is a comic, and this is the story of Capa on, around the time that he heads over to D-Day. So they're prepping for D-Day. He's about to go over, and in fact, right before they head over, Papa Hemingway makes an appearance.
Yes.
Which it's always nice to see Hemingway in comics, but. And then it's about Capa's experience as a photographer on Omaha Beach. He actually made it, but then he had to leave the beach for various reasons. But then the second half of the book is, I guess, divided into 2 parts. That first part of the second half is a series of Capa's photographs that actually survived. And they're not that many. Are there, is it 8 or 12?
Yeah, I'm looking through it right now, and it looks to be about maybe just a few more than a dozen. Yeah,
so it's not many at all, and we learn in the comic why that was, and it wasn't because of the battle action that he experienced as much as it was just problems in development afterwards. There were mistakes that were made. So we do see those original and sometimes very famous photographs that Capa made, and then the last part of the last half of the book is a series of short essays that also are accompanied by photographs, not necessarily Kappa's photographs, but photographs about the war, about D-Day, and about Kappa himself. So, I mean, this is a very useful text. But to me, one of the most striking parts of this multimedia format is the comic and the original Kappa photographs. And you get to see in some of the panels of the comic that both Morvan and Bertail create the visual counterpart of the photographs that Kappa made famous. And so, for instance, there's one this is on the book's front cover, in fact, is a great example of what I'm trying to describe here, probably not too successfully describing, a famous kind of blurry photograph of a soldier on the beach as the water's washing over him, and he's trying to make his way onto shore without being shot, right, by the Germans.
Right.
So there's a part of this famous photograph on the cover of Omaha Beach on D-Day, and then underneath is part of a panel from that first half of the book, which is the comic, and you actually see Robert Kappa photographing this soldier from a perspective of 180 degrees, and so we get to see around where Kappa was, where he was taking this famous photograph, and you have other instances of that in the comic.
Yeah, it's really well done, and one of the things that I particularly appreciated about this text, I did some work a couple years back with Jacques Tardy's It Was the War in the Trenches, which is World War I, so a slightly different scenario, but it was purposefully, I feel, a very claustrophobic book. Most of it takes place within a small space in the trenches. Every once in a while, when the two sides engage, there will be a panel that pulls back. But the entire comic is done in basically each page has 3 equally sized panels that are narrow and long, and they replicate sort of the way that the trenches were set out. And as you're reading through that comic, it feels like you are in the trenches as well. I would argue with this text, one of the things that is really effective is that there are many, many drawings that are giving you the broad view, whether it's boats being loaded up with the soldiers, whether it's the battlefield itself, and then often there are floating panels on top of that show sort of the either the soldiers talking to each other or Kappa's memories of some of the things that he saw, or whatever the narrative is at that point. But you get that broader sense, which I think underscores the almost mythic status of D-Day in the minds of many people, and also really does, because it's so much of geography and weather played into it, it gives you that broader sense of what everything looked like. It felt more like reportage to me, and it felt like a sort of more open text in some ways.
Exactly. And, another thing I particularly appreciated about the comic half of this book is that we do get Robert Kappa from a different temporal perspective. What I mean by that is there are certain panels where, I guess it's the early 1950s, right? So World War II is a while behind him, and we see him in a bathtub or in a place where he's bathing, and he's talking on the phone, and so he's describing what was going on to someone on the day of the landing. So obviously we know that he makes it just because of that, but I do appreciate the way that Morvan in the writing plays around with time. So there are moments before the landing of D-Day, the majority of the moments in the midst of D-Day, and then that shift into a more kind of a flash forward or a prolepsis where we're carried ahead and we can see that Kappa is describing what was going on and giving us a completely different perspective on what went on that day.
I think one of the things that you're alluding to are the different points of entry that a reader could have to this text. Whether it's someone who might prefer to look at the photographs first, then read the comic, vice versa. There's a number of ways that information is conveyed. And, excuse me, that's a trend that I'm seeing more and more in nonfiction that is created more specifically for young people. There's a really good book that came out a few years ago called Through My Eyes. It's by Ruby Bridges, who was the young woman who integrated the New Orleans public schools when she was a little first grader. And, we think about her visually in the Norman Rockwell painting where she's walking with the two guardsmen. And really, Through My Eyes is her attempt to tell her story from a variety of perspectives. So the text includes photographs from the time period. It includes excerpts from a number of newspaper accounts. It includes a picture of the Norman Rockwell painting with interviews with Rockwell and others about that painting. And so a young person picking it up could have multiple points of entry in terms of looking at history. And I think that's what this text is doing really effectively as well.
Right.
So it's really a very beautiful comic on a very sobering subject. It's really a work of art, and it's something that really moved me. I thought it was quite beautiful, actually.
It was. So tonally, we're making a shift here, but let's go ahead and move on to the fourth title that we're going to be looking at today, and that is Gene Luen Yang and Mark Holmes's Secret Coders.
I loved this.
Yes. Now, so if you were going to describe this, and this is going to be the first of a series, we learn, if you were going to describe this to someone, they're picking it up for the first time or they're thinking about it, how would you introduce this, maybe both to a young reader and also maybe to the parent of a young reader?
That's a really good point, because there is a certain amount of didacticism that is beneath the surface of this text.
Right.
But I would argue that it's put forward in such a way that even the most reluctant learner, in terms of sort of a kid who doesn't want to pick up a comic that is preaching to him or her, that's not what it feels like. It's the story of a young woman who transfers into a new school. It looks like a middle school. That's basically her age bracket. And it turns out that her mother is part of the school as well. She's there in a professional capacity. So that's already tough enough.
You kind of gave something away.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's okay, because I don't think it's a spoiler, because we learn it
right away, pretty much.
Well, kind of halfway through, because
okay.
There is a mystery at first. There's a reason why we don't see the mother's face in the opening pages.
Kids, I apologize deeply. But I guess what I'm trying to say is it's a comic that starts off, and I felt it was going to be one of those texts where the major focus would be on this young woman trying to fit in, feeling excluded. And there is some of that goes on, but almost immediately a mystery develops, and a way of seeking out that mystery is put forward, and it's the concept of coding. But I think it's done in such a way that I personally found it extremely enjoyable. I would like to now go take a course in computer programming after having read this text. And I do think that that's part of Gene Luen Yang's purpose in this, and Mike Holmes as well, is to get kids interested in coding. And for this 50-something academic, it worked. I want to know more.
Yeah. Now, we learned at the very end of the book that the next volume is going to be called Secret Coders, Paths and Portals, and so I'm sure there's going to be more math and coding, didactic and otherwise, in that volume, but also it's going to continue the story, because we see, and this is not a spoiler, at the very end of this first book, Secret Coders, that the main character, Hopper, and two of her friends, one a guy named Eni, E-N-I, is it pronounced Eni, Eni?
I think Eni.
And then another guy by the name of Josh, who is kind of a jokester. He doesn't have the best of relationships with Hopper, but Hopper and Eni become quick friends in this book, but they find a space, and it leads them into even more mystery that involves the groundskeeper. And I don't know about you, but when I saw this groundskeeper who at first seems like an antagonistic figure, I couldn't help but think of The Simpsons' groundskeeper's Willie.
Yes, absolutely. My mind went there. It went to every sort of villain in a Scooby-Doo comic.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
But also then, once we learn other things about him, I started to think about Hagrid a little bit from the Harry Potter series. So this is an adult who's sort of on the fringes of the school in a way, and he's an interesting character. He turns out to be a very interesting character, I think.
Right. And, without giving too much away, a lot of the mystery, or some of the mystery behind him, starts to dissipate a bit in the last part. And I think that's one of the joys of this book, that things aren't initially what they seem. And we see this at the very beginning with the birds.
Right.
And that's all a part of the programming as well.
Well, this book almost reminds me a little bit of a visual Encyclopedia Brown book. I don't know if you remember those from your childhood, but they were little short mysteries. And
oh, God, I'd forgotten about those.
Well, at the end of each chapter, you were challenged to solve the mystery. And then at the end of the book, there was a key that would give you both the answer and the rationale for it. Each chapter ends in that way in this text, and the birds are part of that. So as I was reading through, it brought me back to my own childhood reading Encyclopedia Brown. But in this instance, what I think the added layer is you learn something about math, about science, about computers, about robotics. There's a lot of those little pieces of information, but they're woven in so well that it doesn't really, I don't think a child would feel as if they were being preached to, taught, etc. It's just really fun.
Yeah, so. It is. It's a fun story. There is educational value in the text as well, but you're right. It's presented in such a way that the spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. As Mary Poppins said.
But I would also say that the two characters, Hopper and Enid, they're really interesting characters. You start to learn more about them by the end of the text, and you get the sense that you're going to not only learn more, but that they have very particular quirks and traits that will be expanded upon in subsequent texts. I really want to read the next one right now.
Yeah, I'm wondering when it's going to come out.
Because there's a puzzle that you're left with, and I want to know if I did it right. And you don't know until the next book. So cop to it.
Yeah. Talk about a cliffhanger.
That's right.
So this is good. And I'm wondering how many books are going to be in the series.
I don't know. I couldn't find any information that would indicate that. We obviously know another text would be coming out, but I could see this becoming a multi-book series because I assume that as the series progresses, you learn more and more about the way that coding operates and the way that you can solve problems using coding. In the back of the text, there's a little author's note in which Gene Luen Yang talks about the role that coding played in his own life and how it led him to become really interested in math and science in ways that he hadn't anticipated.
Right.
And, he is a former math teacher. So there's definitely a sense that let me put you this way, if I had had this person as my math teacher, I would have loved math. So even if you're a parent and you're thinking about this book for your child, I think that even if your child is a reluctant learner of math, they would enjoy this book. I know I would have as a kid.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it now, like I said. So,
yeah. And I think for the most part, maybe with one or two exceptions, that the kind of comics that Yang writes and illustrates in many ways are for younger readers, but it's a different kind of younger reader depending on the text that you're looking at. So, for instance, I would put books like American-Born Chinese, the Boxers and Saint books, and Shadow Hero in the category of maybe younger reader, but even all age, right? Because there's something quite mature, let's say, about Boxers and Saints especially. Shadow Hero, American-Born Chinese, but definitely could be read by younger readers. And, as you mentioned earlier, American-Born Chinese is taught in a lot of courses dealing with children's and young adult comics, or just children's literature in general. But then there are other books that Yang has written, and usually these are illustrated by someone else, not always, but that are for even younger readers. And into that I would put Secret Coders, level up, and even the stories that make up Animal Crackers.
I agree. It was fun to read this because last summer I spent a couple of months working on an article on Boxers and Saints. And it sort of ties into what we've been talking about today because I was looking at this concept, Jared Gardner's concept of voice print, where he talks about the way that a comic creator's style will often tip you off as to the content of a text. And I was looking at what I called voice prints of violence in comics, comparing sort of the typical black and white comics like Jacques Tardy's It Was the War in the Trenches, or this Omaha beach text that we've just talked about, as being the typical way that comics creators will write about serious political and social conflict. Boxers and Saints is a work of historical fiction. There's violence on almost every page, but it's drawn in the clear line style and it's super colorful. So I spent all last summer really thinking about the way that Yang depicts violence and the choices that he's made. And it's an extremely beautiful diptych. It's, Boxers and Saints. They're two texts that together tell the story of the Boxer Rebellion, but from different perspectives. And to read Secret Coders, it was exciting for me because in some ways, while I absolutely loved Boxers and Saints, I've always sort of associated Yang with more contemporary pop culture texts like American-Born Chinese, which, though dealing with a very serious topic, is very much also dealing with popular culture, and so is Level Up, and so is this text. And so for me, it was like returning to the Gene Luen Yang that I first encountered when I began teaching his works, nearly a decade ago now. But I will be using Secret Coders in my class. I may even change my text list for next semester because it's one of those books that I'd like to share with future teachers, because I very often will look at a text that's overtly didactic and the students will say, oh, this was so painful to read. But this one, there's a lot that a young person would learn from reading it, but it's extremely painless and enjoyable. So.
Right. I have to admit to never having taught Yang text in class, and I hate that fact, but I'll tell you the reason why. There's so many times that I've wanted to teach American-Born Chinese, but I haven't for this reason. I know of other people who have, and in fact, where I used to teach at A&M Commerce, this was a text that was always taught in a children's lit class. And as much as I wanted to teach it in a comics class, or let's say a multi-ethnic American lit class, which I used to use comics in those courses as well, I didn't, because I knew that the students already had that, and so my feelings were, why give them something that they've already had? I'll give them something that – I do think that this is one of those, if you want to call it canonical text, that's taught quite often, American-Born Chinese. I think for good reason. I just regret the fact that I still haven't taught American-Born Chinese.
Well, yeah, I always taught it in my either my intermediate reader or my multicultural adolescent reader courses. When I taught the last time I taught comic studies, I did teach Boxers and Saints, but I think that's an appropriate environment for that text because there's so much background information that students need in order to truly enjoy those texts. So it's one of those things where even if you were teaching it in I had to devote 2 weeks to it, and I enjoyed it, and the students really enjoyed it. But it's one of those things where then you're starting to weigh what they're missing out on because you needed that extra week. So with Gene Luen Yang, if you're teaching young people, Secret Coders was, I think, under 100 pages. If I remember correctly, it was maybe only 78 pages long. And so it's also a quick read, and it'd be easy to slip into a syllabus or, it's. But that said, it's very well done. And we haven't even talked about the art. There's the color choice. It's very minimalist in terms of its use of color, which I actually liked because it helped you to remain focused on some of the computational things that were going on in the text. So
exactly, yeah. In fact, I was looking. Secret Coders is just about 90 pages, so it's not a long book at all. It's something that could be used in the classroom, and thinking about Yang in the classroom, next time I teach a course in comics, I would love to use Shadow Hero, because not only is it a great story to use, but also the way that Yang and Sonny Liu engage with the superhero genre and superhero history. Green Turtle they're basing that character off an actual comic.
Right.
And so it would be perfect to use in a course on, let's say, a general intro to comics, or even a course in ethnicity and narrative, because this deals with Asianness within a superhero context.
Mm-hmm. And I will say this, one of the nice things about Secret Coders is there are characters from a variety of backgrounds. It's one of those texts where that is not necessarily the center of what is happening in the text. Nonetheless, it's always exciting to have diverse characters in a text and to be able to share those with young readers. And so I was excited to see that.
Yeah, exactly. And even the difference is indeterminate in places.
Right. But it's still, and again, I think the color scheme actually helps with that in some ways.
Yeah, this is, I guess, a monochrome narrative in that you have the grays, but it's kind of a lighter green.
Mm-hmm.
A lighter and a darkish green, so, but it's the gray tones and green is what you have.
Yeah, it's really very nice to look at as well. It's beautifully drawn, of course. Luen and Yang can't do anything but draw wonderful, wonderful panels. But I really, really enjoyed it. Mm.
Well, another book, since we're on the topic of education, is Maris Wicks' Human Body Theater.
Yes.
Now, you love this book, I can tell.
I did. It made me laugh.
It's fun.
It is.
Now, are you familiar with Wicks' other books?
No, but I'm going to be now. I adore this book, and I adored the art. I adored all the gags. It was one of those books that I went into with some trepidation because personally, while I do a lot of work in scholarship and theory, nonfiction isn't always the first sort of book that I'm going to pick up for leisure reading. And then something that's dealing with bodily processes, you get to a certain age and you watch the nightly news and everything that's wrong with you, there's a pill for it. So, right. But I absolutely learned a great deal from this and I really enjoyed it.
Well, I ask about your experience with Wicks's works because I think she does, not everything, but many of the things that she does has that educational feel to it. And my first experience with her was the book that she did with Jim Ottaviani, Primates, The Fearless Science of Jane Goodall, Diane Fossey, and Bertail Galdikas. And I even met and talked with the two of them a couple of years ago at Heroes Con. I briefly interviewed them for the podcast. So that was my introduction to her work. And so given the nature of what Primates is about, it just makes sense that she would do a book on the human body. And, this is a book called Human Body Theater on the human body. And we do learn about the various organs, the functions, the systems, everything that goes on in the body. And it's fun. And not only is this obviously appropriate to younger readers, but for adults, it's also very informative. There's a lot that, as I was reading this over the past week, there were times that I was sitting in the living room with my wife, Amanda, and, she would be doing something, and I was reading Human Body Theater, and I'd say, out loud. I didn't even think. And Amanda would go, well, what? And so I would read a fact. I said, I did not know this. And, of course, Amanda, who comes from a science background, said, you didn't know that? It's like, well, no, I didn't. And so there were many of those moments, but it's very informative.
I loved it. I loved everything about it. First of all, I have to say that it's funny from a gag perspective. So as an example, the theater trope is useful too, by the way, and it's the first of a couple books we're going to be talking about that uses that conceit of the theater as the place where the text unfolds. But in this case, the skeleton, who's the sort of guide through the human body, starts off by saying, "I'm a bona fide human skeleton," but bump bump. And so it's just really adorable. Also, one of the things that I liked was that when we get into the really sciencey parts of the book where we're talking about different molecules and elements and how they work together, these little like atoms and things, they're all like the atoms are adorable. They're personified. You know that sort of art style that's really popular right now where you'll see a bacon and egg holding hands and running, right? And they've got cute little faces, or salt and pepper shakers that have little arms and legs and cute faces.
That's an art style that is hip in today, you're saying?
It's always been hip, but I mean, it's super hip with the young people. My students will come in all the time wearing these cute T-shirts from Threadless and other places that focus on that. Well, here, I think the stars of this text are really the oxygen, right? Oxygen and sodium chloride and all these different kinds of little elements that come together, and they do these wonderful little dances, and they jump into body parts and jump out of them, and it was really fun to look at.
Yeah, it is. And in fact, I was just looking through the book, and some of these characters that you're mentioning, I just went to page 7, in fact, and see cytoplasm. And I could see someone having cytoplasm on a T-shirt.
Oh yeah, or the dance of the oxygen fairies is like the way that they describe what happens when you breathe. Honestly, I found that really informative. But now I will, of course, always think about oxygen fairies dancing in my lungs. But that's useful.
Yeah, it is. And we've been pointing out the fun and humorous aspect of this book, but there are pages where Wicks's art comes across as something almost akin to anatomy texts. Mm-hmm. And I don't think there are many most of the pages aren't like this, but every now and again our narrator, Bones, takes us into what are in essence cutaways, like you would find in anatomy books, whether it be of the muscular system or bones.
The heart is displayed in a variety of ways, but in one instance, there's a whole page spread of it drawn very realistically and with just text next to it, just the way you would find it in an anatomy book.
Exactly. And so I think interspersing these every now and again with the more humorous, cartoony art, very effective.
And there's one other thing I really liked about it. There's a useful explanation in many parts in the text on ailments that are relatively common and that would happen to a young person. So, for instance, in one section where the discussion is on the bones, you get a really good set of illustrations about the way that a bone heals after a fracture. Mm-hmm. Or, there's another one where when you contract the common cold, how does that actually work out within your body? And so it's one of those sorts of texts where there's a lot of information that's presented, but it's presented in a way where I think the young reader is always uppermost in mind. And the sort of ailments that are focused on are things that your average healthy kid might encounter, such as breaking an arm or something like that.
Exactly. Now, you were mentioning the primary audience being younger readers, and this gets back to something that you had alluded to earlier. Readers of Human Body Theater will find many references to snot, boogers,
yes.
farts. So, this is the kind of thing that not only is informative and educational for both younger and older readers, but also would appeal to younger and older readers who like to read about boogers and farts.
Let's just say mucus is really cute.
Yes, mucus is cute.
Yeah. Much cuter in this book than in real life.
Yeah.
I'm just going to say.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. It's the sort of thing where I wish I had had this book as a kid, because it has a sense of humor to it. There's a lot of funny wordplay and visuals, but it's also extremely informative. As you said, as I was reading it, I was learning things that I really had never known before. I feel like I could use it as a reference text.
Exactly. Now, I was also impressed at the way that Wicks handles the I guess the sexual issues, and we see this primarily in Act 8 or Chapter 8, if we want to call it that, the reproductive system.
Right.
I mean, that is something that I think had the potential of being not so much inappropriate, but I think that in the hands of a less apt artist and writer, he or she would attempt to overcompensate and, in other words, try to paper over the sexual reproductive aspect of human anatomy. And Wicks does not do that at all.
Yeah, she's very respectful and informative. And I would even say the chapter on hormones is the same.
Yeah.
And those are your friends for your entire life, people. So I actually really enjoyed that chapter.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think it's handled extremely well throughout the text, and it's very forthright information. I'm the daughter of a nurse, and I grew up with someone who, if I ask a question that involved human biology, she gave me a very honest and clearly explained answer. And in a way, that's what this text does as well. It doesn't talk down to kids. It's very straightforward about the way that the human body operates. And because that is the vantage point, I think that the chapters you mentioned, like in Act 8, they just come across really as being genuine, informative, and well done.
Yeah.
I loved it.
Yeah.
So.
This is definitely one of the highlights of this week's readings. I mean, all of them are great, but
they are. And I'm really just thinking, as we've been talking through these, I'm sure people are beginning to see this, that First Second really has a wide variety of texts that are drawn in a variety of styles, and all of them really have something to offer. Mm-hmm. So.
Well, speaking of another educational book that is
Yes.
drawn in a very striking and unique style, this is Ian Lendler and Zack Giallongo's The Stratford Zoo Midnight Review presents Romeo and Juliet. Now, were you aware of their previous book, the one on Macbeth?
Yes, I actually read through that as well. And I loved both of them.
Okay, because, I think I received a review copy of Stratford Zoo Midnight Review Presents Macbeth when it came out, I guess it was last year, and I meant to read it, but then put it to the side and didn't. So then when I saw that the Romeo and Juliet book was about to be released and that we were going to do a first-second show, a publisher spotlight, I said, okay, I have to fish out my copy of Macbeth and now read that along with Romeo and Juliet. And I have to say that reading both of these back to back, I think helped me to appreciate both more. And what Lendler and Giallongo is doing in this series, basically you have a zoo, as the title suggests. It's a place called the Stratford Zoo, appropriately named since they're doing Shakespearean performances. But when the zookeepers are away, let's say in the evenings or when they're not around, then the animals of the zoo get together and put on a play. So some of them are performers, many of them are audience members. And the two plays that they've put on so far in the book that came out last year, it was Macbeth, and the one that just came out is Romeo and Juliet. So these are books, I think, if I've done quite a bit of work in comics and adaptation, these would be fair game in studies of adaptation theory, and comics, because what Lendler and Giallongo are doing here is adapting these Shakespearean tragedies to comics form, but in a very, very different way.
Yeah, one of the things that I think I would have appreciated as a young reader, and what I think makes these very accessible for a younger audience, is that the audience members themselves, members of the zoo who are watching the performance, are shown throughout the texts to have asides. So while a character might be declaiming on the stage, you get if not a translation of what's being said, a response to it that helps provide that context from other animals who aren't dressed up. They're just animals hanging out eating popcorn and watching the theater production, but they add that extra point of view, that extra commentary almost. And there's a lot of the verbal gags that go on in this are set out that way. but I think it makes it opens up the performance in a way that it wouldn't have if it had just been, let's take some animals, dress them up, have them be a little bit goofy, and do this. Instead, you get almost that meta commentary going on, which I think draws the reader in even more.
Oh, exactly. And I'm glad you mentioned this, because I think this is especially the case with the most recent book, the one on Romeo and Juliet, in that the interplay, the meta-narrative interplay between the performance on stage and the audience members commenting on what they're watching are very connected. And I'm thinking in particular of the audience members, the young sheep and the young chimpanzee, who at the beginning of this book do not get along at all. In other words, they come from they're two different animals, right? And so they're two different species. They don't get along. There's this conflict. And you have something similar unfolding on stage before their eyes. The classic, Romeo and Juliet coming from two different families, two different worlds. In the Stratford Zoo Midnight Review presents Romeo and Juliet, this is represented by, let's say, Juliet is a young bear and Romeo is a rooster, but I think what compounds the difference even more is the fact that Romeo comes from a group of animals that are called petters, right? So they're the kind of animals who are on farms or who are in zoos. And then Juliet is from the wild, so animals who are out there just doing their own thing. Those are the rough and tumble animals. And so those are the real two worlds that are divided, not so much the world of roosters or fowl and bears. It's the petters and the wilds. And so these are the two worlds that are at conflicts. And so you get Romeo and Juliet, representatives of these worlds, coming together. And as this book progresses, the young sheep and the lamb and the chimp in the audience are starting to get along a little better.
Right, so you get that parallel track going on, which I like too. And the chimp especially is really good at pointing things out. I'm on page 57 where Romeo and Juliet are sort of speaking to each other, and it's directly taken out of Shakespeare. And there's a little offset panel, and the chimp says, "Boy, that poetry is tricky stuff." And so, it's that sort of thing that will keep a reader, it will stop a young reader to sort of assure them, yeah, this isn't the easiest thing in the world, but keep at it, and so it's actually really encouraging.
Yeah.
So.
Now you mentioned the poetry and the use of Shakespearean language. One of the things I found, not only in the Romeo and Juliet text, the most recent one, as well as the one that came out last year on Macbeth, more times than not, the creators don't use Shakespeare's language, or if they do, they use it very minimally. And so they don't adapt the actual text itself, but they paraphrase, and there are certain moments that, and I guess by the very nature of these books for younger readers, I don't say they water down what goes on, but they make it more palatable. So, I mean, these, Macbeth and Romeo and Juliet are two tragedies, and they don't end in good places, needless to say. But the way that these creators deal with that, I think, makes it this gets back to the trope of the performance, right? Right. Because where the kids or the audience members seem to be unsettled by what goes on, others point out this is only a play, so there's nothing to get upset or cry about, and so they're okay with that.
Yeah, there's also, I think, a real dual audience component here as well for parents and kids. I'm going to actually give you the example that sticks in my mind it's from Macbeth. Okay. But there are other ones in Romeo and Juliet. But right at the very beginning of Macbeth, when Macbeth is at the point where he's at the height of his success and his feelings of pride, and he's offered a sandwich and the character says, "Look, I've made you a sandwich. It's dripping in ketchup the way you like it."
Oh, I see, yeah.
And, we know as adult readers that's going to, it's foreshadowing. It's going to be, the idea of blood being so significant in that text. And so there's a real dual audience component there. A kid might, on the first read, especially if they're unfamiliar with the origin text, might just think that's really funny and gross and icky. We're getting back to the grossness moments there. But for an adult reader who might be reading that with a kid, there's just that moment of sort of subtle recognition of sort of a reference to the origin text in a way that adults would immediately pick up on.
Oh, that's right. And in the Macbeth book, ketchup becomes much more prominent as the story unfolds, to the point that it becomes linked to Lady Macbeth's out damn spot.
Yeah. So, there's ways that I guess that's one of the things, too, that this is a text where something that could have been really complicated for a young reader to understand is not only made. It's not that it's watered down, but a lot of the reference are things that young people would experience in their own lives or understand from their own experience. So I really enjoyed that part of it.
Yeah. And, getting back to this as an adapted text, I know there are a lot of people who aren't big fans of the old classics illustrated and what they attempted to do. And, beginning back in the 1940s, what Classics Illustrated its founders wanted the series to be is a way into the literature. So the comic itself becomes almost an ancillary or gateway text, maybe a gateway drug. And the assumption was, okay, if we have a comic book that is based on, let's say in this case, Hamlet, that someone would read it and be more apt to pick up and appreciate the play Hamlet or Scarlet Letter or Fall of the House of Usher or the Leatherstocking Tales or, any classic work of literature.
Right.
And I have no problem with what Classic Illustrated Comics did. I enjoy many of them. They're not without their own problems. But to me, if that intention, whether you believe it or not, to get people reading the classics, if that was one of the main purposes of Classics Illustrated, I think that the Stratford Zoo series would be much more effective, because what the Stratford Zoo Midnight Review Presents series does is it takes young readers on their own territory. And, it does not dumb down the classic, I don't think, by any means, but it opens it up and presents it in such a way that makes it not only more palatable to a younger reader, but it hits certain buttons that they're going to respond to. For instance, you mentioned, the snot or the gooiness like the ketchup in the Macbeth one. And we have the same kind of, let's say the jokes or the visual references, sometimes the slapstick, that are going to get the kids on their own grounds. And then, but if you take the gist of, let's say, Romeo and Juliet, the story that these animals are watching performed on stage, this is what Romeo and Juliet is about. So after having read this book, then people know what happened in Romeo and Juliet.
Right. And, the interesting thing, if you think about the whole set of texts available to young readers, there's then a series of adaptations that are simply the texts illustrated that are available to young readers as well. There are many companies that have done these sorts of adaptations, and that's another level. And then there's the actual text. And, when we think about what gets kids interested in more complicated ideas, they need that foundation first. In Secret Coders, I learned a lot about code that was very foundational and would make me want to know more. And I feel like the same thing is true in this text too, that I think a young reader would say, wow, I found that to be sort of compelling. This is an interesting storyline to me. Now maybe I would want to move on to read another version. So, it's sort of building that building blocks idea.
Exactly. Well, this whole idea of adaptive texts and comics serving as kind of a building block, as you put it, is maybe a nice segue into the last title that we're discussing on this show, and that is Chris Duffy's edited collection, Fable Comics.
Yeah, it was really an exciting read for me. And in fact, you had been talking about whether or not I had read Mavis Wicks' text before. Well, she has a story in this that, again, is very involves instruction, involves the body. And so it was kind of cool to see that, to see that repetition there. But there are also a lot of other comics creators I was really excited to see, many of them who publish with first, second books, including Vera Broskel, who's done Anya's Ghost. She has a story in this. And what I really loved were the different illustration styles that were employed throughout. Mm-hmm. It made it it made it an anthology that I think young readers would turn to again and again. There's a style for every possible taste, and just really again an instructive set of fables, but interpreted with a lot of interesting sight gags and verbal gags from the contributors.
Right. Now, most of the books that we're discussing on this first, second spotlight are series, either books in an ongoing series or, in the case of Secret Coders, the first of what will be a series. So that's the case with The Battling Boy, Fall of the House of West, same case with Last Man, The Chase, Secret Coders, Stratford Zoo Midnight Review series. Mm-hmm. I think that Fable Comics is maybe loosely also a part of a series because this follows in the steps of the two previous books that Duffy has edited for First Second. Back in 2011, there was Nursery Rhyme Comics, and then 2 years ago, 2013, Fairy Tale Comics that do something very similar. Now, had you read those?
I've read Fairy Tale Comics, and I'm actually thinking about using it. I have to tell you that after years and years and years of teaching fairy tales, there comes a point where you just want to not teach them anymore.
Exactly.
And I'm always looking for new and interesting ways to introduce students to folklore and fairy tales. And Fairy Tale Comics is set up very much like this one with a number of different contributors and a certain interesting twist on some of the traditional fairy tales. So, but yeah, I would argue that all three books are in dialogue with each other and presenting some of the earliest reading experiences that young people have in comics form.
Exactly. And, like you, I was familiar with Fairy Tale Comics. I haven't yet picked up Nursery Rhyme Comics, and that's one of those that I keep wanting to get, but I just haven't gotten around to it. But yeah, I do think it's quite impressive, the number of creators in these volumes, the ones that we've discussed, the nursery rhymes, the fables, and then the fairy tales. Now, in the current one, Fable Comics, oh, God, look at the variety. We have James Kalchaka adapting The Fox and the Grapes. Sophie Goldstein, The Leopard Drums Up Dinner. A guy who has defined much of his career by strange adaptation comics, and that is Robert Sikoyak. He does The Lion and the Mouse. Eleanor Davis, The Old Man and Death. One of my heroes, Jaime Hernandez, The Boy Who Cried Wolf. I was kind of sorry to see Gilbert that wasn't in this book. But, oh, well, he was in a previous one. Gregory Benton, a great artist that I got to know this year, did the adaptation of The Hen and the Mountain Turtle. And, on that topic, we should point out that there are many of these fables that I guess we would call classic, the Aesop fables that you're used to. But what Chris Duffy does is he pulls from other cultures and other traditions, as in the case of the hen and the mountain turtle, because, they're fables as well. So he tries to round things out a bit. Well,
one other thing that educators might be interested to know is that there are lesson plans attached to this that one can get off of the First Second website that encourage young readers to create fables of their own and to illustrate them and to create their own comics. So this is one, every once in a while, First Second will do this with one of their texts. And so they've done this for fables, and I had just clicked on it actually. And it's not just saying write your own, it's write your own comic storyboard first, then create your comics. So what I really like is that it's not just an attention to the form of the fable, but it's an attention to the form of comics as well. Mm-hmm. So, it's to me, that's the best of both worlds. But I'm biased, of course.
Yeah. And, you do have a variety of adaptation styles, and not only in terms of the art. I mean, there are some, and I think a case of this or an example of this would be Jaime Hernandez's The Boy Who Cried Wolf. Mm-hmm. It's pretty much spot on as to what that fable was all about. In other words, he doesn't take much liberty with that. On the other hand, you have a couple of contributions that go wild, or at least wilder. There's Robert Sekoyak's Lying and Mouse, and this is drawn in the style of Crazy Cat. And, this is one of the things that Sekoyak does with his comics is he takes styles of, let's say, older kind of comic creators, in this case, George Harriman, and he retells a story in that style. So the Lion and Mouse look like a Crazy Cat comic. But I think even wilder off script, so to speak, is the next one, Jennifer L. Meyer's Fox and Crow. And in fact, that strikes me as one of the most artistically stylized adaptations in this collection. Mm-hmm. Did you think so as well?
Yeah, I did. And it's interesting, too, because I have to say that the styles were so radically different that it was truly like... what I will say, Derek, is, I teach a lot of anthologies, or at least in the past I have, and very often they're created by the same creator. And so you're getting the stories, but the illustrations look the same, and the interpretation is going to be the same. So whether it's a parody text, where all of the illustrations are parodies like The Stinky Cheese Man, or it's, or it's a very serious anthology where they're trying to, create an improving book for young minds and have very literal illustrations. There's definitely a link up between the text and the image. In this instance, you have really the true, as you point out, in some of these, the true interpretive role of the comics creator comes through. And so it's truly like reading a different comic when you turn each page. So.
You made me think of something that I had...
Uh-oh.
Oh, yeah, watch out. I had almost forgotten this, but as I was reading the Fables comics and then going back and looking again at the Fairy Tale comics to prepare for this episode, I was thinking, okay, I would like to bring up the work of, and I'm never sure how to pronounce his name, but this is John Shisheka.
Yeah.
Because you mentioned Stinky Cheese Man.
Yeah.
And I know that his books where he adapts these stories, I love them. We used to read them to our kids, Zack and Zoe, when they were really young. And in fact, Amanda and I would read them for as much our enjoyment as for the kids, especially The Stinky Cheese Man and Other Fairly Stupid Tales. Mm-hmm. Now, where I'm going with this is I wanted to ask you the difference between what Shiseka is doing in books like The Stinky Cheese Man and Other Fairly Stupid Tales, and what Duffy and Company is doing with Fable Comics, Fairy Tale Comics, and Nursery Rhyme Comics.
Okay, I'm happy to do that, but go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, no. I don't necessarily want you to do it in a formalized way, but one of the things that has come up every now and again on the podcast is this kind of fuzzy, at times, border space between what we call comics and what we call normally picture books, because sometimes picture books look quite a bit like comics to the point that we would be hard pressed to tell one from the other.
Well, in the example that you mentioned here, one of the things that, if we go back to the traditional definition of comics as sequential art, there are some picture book creators who use panels, who will create a story where, in order to understand the story, you need to move from panel to panel. I'm thinking specifically of another somewhat postmodern picture book by David Wiesner called The Three Pigs, which takes the traditional story of the Three Little Pigs, and it becomes sort of one of those things where the first page is a panel where you have a wolf looking down at the pigs who are building their houses, and you have the traditional beginning of that story. Once upon a time, there were three pigs, etc. But then as the book moves on, the characters, the pigs, escape the story. And as they escape the story space, the panels in which the traditional story is being conveyed, they remain behind, but they become askew. They end up falling down, and you have this sort of juxtaposition between the story, which continues on, and the pigs who have left the story. Mm-hmm. So there, actually, sequentiality is very important to understanding that picture book, and I would say it's much closer to a comic. A text like The Stinky Cheese Man, where you have a number of characters who repeat throughout the text. They're either running from something or they're commenting on the text itself in a very self-referential way. Like the table of contents crushes a character,
right?
As an example. There you have both that sort of graphic manipulation that you often see in a comic where things burst through the panels, etc. But you don't necessarily have that sequentiality going on. Here, these are discrete. In Duffy's text, we're looking at discrete comics that are, for the most part, drawn with panels where those are linked together. But I think the spirit isn't all that different.
Right, yeah. Now, I think that the Duffy books, like Fable Comics, unquestionably comics, right?
Right.
I think what I have, and this is almost like a side issue, kind of a tangent that I just kind of threw in there. We don't have to stay on this much longer at all. But, sometimes I have a problem with people who try to make hard definitions or hard distinctions between picture books and comics, sometimes using arguments of sequentiality or paneling, because, there are many examples of comics where the sequence is between and among pages, where you will have a page or, quite a number of pages that are composed of nothing but just one panel. And so in many ways, the characteristics that define a picture book you can find in what we would normally call comics, and then vice versa as well. Now, the reason I threw this in here is to kind of complicate the distinctions between these two forms, these two kind of presentations of narrative, and I kind of like that kind of complication. I'm okay with the indeterminate more times than not.
Me too.
Yeah, but to get back to Fable Comics, I think that both what Sheska, but Sheska.
It's so sad too, Derek, because he's from Flint, Michigan.
Oh, he is?
I should really know how to pronounce his last name, but every time I pronounce it differently. And that's even after I listen to it online to remember how to pronounce it. But I think you're in the neighborhood. So.
Okay.
And he's very comfortable with that, by the way.
Yeah.
He's told me he's said that to people in interviews, and I've heard him speak, and he said that as well. So I think he wouldn't be upset with us.
But what he's doing with books like The Stinky Cheese Man and other Fairly Stupid Tales is very similar in content to what Duffy and company are doing in Fable Comics, Fairy Tale Comics, and Nursery Rhyme Comics. There's the adaptation element, of course, but also there is the big time humor.
And there's the interrogation of form in certain instances, too. In other words, the idea of let's look at what the fable is. There are a couple of these where because of perhaps the way that they're laid out, the patness of the moral either is very clear or else actually is obscured. And because of all the gags that have gone on, you've kind of lost track of the moral of the story. And I really like that, actually. So.
Exactly. And even when the moral is made overt, obvious, it's done in a way that's very self-conscious. And the best examples of these for me are George O'Connor's Hermes fables. And there, I think, 3 of these in the book, or maybe there's 4 and I'm forgetting one. But at the beginning of these stories, we get an introduction to Hermes. So on page 45, Hermes and the Woodsman, starring that rascally rogue Hermes. And then later on toward the back of the book, beginning on page 113, Hermes and the Sculptor, starring that rapscallion scalawag Hermes. And in all of these stories, there is some kind of moral to be drawn, and that moral is presented by what looks like almost a little chibi Hermes. And he's holding up a placard. So, for instance, in Hermes and the Sculptor, the moral is artists are stupid. And then there are other alternatives. Art is dead, or, the artist is a blockhead, or everyone's a critic. And then in the case of Hermes and the Woodsman, the moral is honesty is the best policy. So, not only sometimes are the morals humorous, such as the one with the Sculptor, but also they are kind of covertly humorous in the way that they're playing around consciously so with the fable's form.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will also just make a point. This is one of the comics that we've looked at that really is playing with color a lot. Because you have such very different creators who are making contributions. Some are using a very rich color palette. Others, like I'm thinking of the Town Mouse and the Country Mouse by Tom Gould. That one, it just uses a sort of characteristic light brown background, but it's absolutely fitting to the story itself. And it's, I guess what I'm trying to say is the production values for this volume are very high. The color is beautiful. I don't have the actual text. I was looking at this online, but I'm going to purchase the text. In part, I can already tell just by the way that the images have come across that it's going to be a gorgeous text with beautiful paper. It really is very nice. So.
Oh, it is. And, as you were talking about the different styles as it applies to the color palette, I opened it up to page 10 in Sophie Goldstein's story, Leopard Drums Up Dinner. And this is from an Angolan fable. And one of the things you find is not only this, I think, typical Sophie Goldstein art, but also the way that she uses color here. These are very bright, vibrant, kind of basic colors, right? So you don't have the kind of muted appearance that we have in others. And so her use of color in many ways is similar to Jaime Hernandez's The Boy Who Cried Wolf. And especially, I guess, in the case of Jaime, it strikes me as kind of classic comic book art, which tells you quite a bit of where Jaime is coming from in terms of his influences. I mean, the kind of color and even the panel layout of The Boy Who Cried Wolf is something that you would find in classic comic books like maybe the Classics Illustrated or the old superhero or even the romance comics, right? So,
but then like in Fox and The Crow, you have that sort of highly stylized, almost picture book-like illustration.
Oh, yeah.
And so,
painterly, even.
Yeah, exactly. So you get an extensive sort of palette of different styles, and I think that's exciting too. That really recommends this book, I think, in many ways. It does it for me. I really love it.
Yeah.
I'm really seriously considering putting this on the syllabus too. That's the problem. You see, there's so many books, so little time.
Yeah, and in pointing out some of these that may be our favorites, I mean, you kind of go down that rabbit hole, right? Because you could more or less pick every single one of these as a favorite, but then favorite loses all meaning then. And then if you point out one over the other, you feel like you're ignoring some of the other creators.
Yeah, there's some really and also just in terms of number, it looks to me, I didn't count the exact number, but it's a 122-page book. And I would say there's at least 24 fables. So, and sometimes, as you said, different variants of some of the same stories. And so you get to see examples from different cultures or different backgrounds. There's also a very nice editor's note and list of contributors and their bios in the back. So if your young reader saw this and really enjoyed the comic style of one of the comics artists, they could find more of the work too. So in that sense, it has a nice nice reference element as well.
Exactly. And, some of the contributions in this collection, I'm glad that are here, and not necessarily just because of the art. I mean, I am glad to see Linear and his adaptation of The Mouse Council, which is based on a medieval European fable, because I think it's great to introduce his work to more U.S. readers. But then there are other examples of creators that I think it's important for them to be in this collection, because either one, we get to see more of what they do, or maybe along with that, we rarely get to see their work, and so anything that they come out with is cause for celebration. So, for instance, the aforementioned Sequoiac adaptation, I think I'm always intrigued to see what Sequoiac does with his own adaptation and what comic great he's going to refer to. And in this case is George Harriman. But another creator I'm really happy to see in this collection is Mark Newgarden and his adaptation of Ambrose Bierce's Man and Wart. And this is on page 79.
Yeah.
And, this is kind of typical Mark Newgarden art, the way he adapts this story. It's just a 4-pager. But the reason I'm glad to see him here is he doesn't do a lot. And we don't see much, or at least I don't see much, from Mark Newgarden. Every now and again you'll see a piece of his in a collection someplace. He doesn't have that many books. And so, again, any occasion for his comics is cause for celebration in my book.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think this is really time for a patented Derek and Gwen hat tip to an editor, because a lot of you didn't know there was that, but there is, and it's patented. A lot of times we sometimes lose sight of that, and I think Duffy's done an amazing job here of collecting some very diverse fables, diverse art styles, as you say, highlighting some comics creators that we often either don't see enough of, or else we've only seen them in other capacities as comics creators, either for adults or for maybe teenagers. So seeing them sort of work in this medium is exciting too for younger readers.
Right.
This has been a great show, Derek. I feel like I have learned so much from reading these comics, and I hope our listeners have too.
Yeah, well, Gwen, this is a little longer episode because we've had so much to discuss, which we usually do in a publisher spotlight. We started off with a discussion of Paul Pope, J.T. Petty, and David Rubin's Battling Boy, The Fall of the House of West. Then we moved on to Balak, Sanlaville, and Vives' Last Day, The Chase. After that, it was Omaha Beach on D-Day by Morvan and Bertail, based on the photography of Robert Capa. Then we went on to Jean Louis Yang and Mike Holmes' Secret Coders, Maris Wicks's Human Body Theater, Ian Lendler and Zack Giallongo's The Stratford Zoo Midnight Review presents Romeo and Juliet. And we wrapped up with a really interesting collection edited by Chris Duffy by many, many, many creators, Fable Comics.
Yeah, it's really a great collection of books, and again, showing the diversity of offerings from First, Second Press. And remember, this is just the fall list. I'm already excited about spring, so...
Yep.
Yay.
And if you want to, at some point, pre-order those spring books coming out from First Second, then you would do well to do so through the website of our sponsor. Now, our sponsor is Discount Comic Book Service, and their website is dcbservice.com. You can't go wrong. They have great prices. And in fact, if you want books that are already out that you're not going to be pre-ordering, then you can visit the website of DCB Service's sister company, and that is In Stock Trades. In fact, right now, if you go to instocktrades.com and you type in Battling Boy, you'll find the latest Battling Boy book, Fall of the House of West, at 25% off cover price. So instead of paying $9.99, you'll pay only $7.49. But of course, you can find the other Battling books there as well, like Battling Boy at 25% off, and also The Rise of Aurora West at 25% off. And other First, Second books are there as well. So whether you go to Discount Comic Book Service or In Stock Trades, you can't go wrong with those guys. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch and let us know what you think of the things we discussed in this episode. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll see on the right-hand side of your browser a tab that says Send Voicemail. Click on that, and from the comfort of your own desktop or mobile device, you can send us a voice message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. It's very simple and easy to use. But if you want to be difficult about things, well, pick up the phone and give us a call. Our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can also email us. We're 2guys@comicsalternative.com. If you want to contact me directly, I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And Gwen, how can people get in touch with you directly?
I am Gwen at comicsalternative.com.
It's neat how that works.
It is.
Yes. You can also find us all over the social media sphere. On Twitter, we're at @2 guys with PhDs, and thanks to everyone who continues to retweet our tweets. Yes.
Easy for you to say.
Exactly. You can also find us on all the usual suspects, such as Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, and Pinterest. We also have a YouTube channel, so you can listen to the show that way. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn. And, of course, you can find every single one of our episodes, as well as our reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog. And that's on our website, comicsalternative.com.
All comics all the time, Derek.
That's right, and we're here for you guys. So thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.
Right. Well, thanks so much, Derek. I really enjoyed this.
Oh, we'll do this again in the near future, I'm sure.
Yay.
Yay. So until next time, I'm Derek.
I'm Gwen.
We'll see you later.
See ya.